Hi, everybody. Welcome to our broadcast today. I'm Jessica Williams. I'm the curator of history and collections here at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum, and I am delighted to welcome you to our live programming today. We're so happy that you're joining us, and I look forward to answering as many of your questions as I can over the course of the presentation today. Our live streams are free, so if you'd like to support us in delivering all this exciting content, we really encourage you to click on the link in the description below. And one really, really important thing I want to mention to everybody before we get into today's presentation is that a very exciting milestone is coming for us this Thursday, and that is that the museum is reopening to visitors. That's again this Thursday, March 25th. And we had been open and closed. We're opening again. Spring is here in New York City, and we are delighted to welcome people aboard. Of course, we're maintaining all of our health and safety procedures to keep our staff and our visitors safe while they come on board. So go look on our website for additional information about what you can expect. We have a couple new things coming up that we're opening with our reopening. So just check it out, and we hope that you will pay us a visit. But today, for our presentation, we are going to be talking about our collection of posters related to women in World War II. If this is March, we are in Women's History Month, and it's really important, I think, to talk about what we have in our collections and how we talk about the contributions of women to World War II. And we have our collection of posters is a decent size. We have some things from World War I, many things from World War II, and these posters really were designed to unify and mobilize Americans during World War II. And these posters, they're a blend of art and advertising. They were inexpensive to produce, so there are many of them, which is why you see many of them in museum collections, or people like to collect them personally. They're very easy to comprehend. You get a quick look at a poster and understand what it's talking about. They're very eye-catching, and what all of these posters did was sell a message that that every American had a responsibility to contribute to the war effort in World War II. And during World War II, many of these posters were aimed at women. Of course, there are posters aimed at men to join the military and all of that. But the government really wanted to rally women to participate in war-related activities. And these posters also show how Americans were struggling and grappling with this idea of understanding what a woman's role could be in the war, what their role should be during the war. And so all the posters we're looking at today are in our collection, and we'll also look at a couple of other items that are in the collection that aren't necessarily posters. But first, the first thing I'm actually going to show you is not a poster, and also does not involve any women. But this is just to clarify about Intrepid, right? So Intrepid was in service from 1943 until 1970 war, and 1974. And over the course of those 31 years in the Navy, no women served on board Intrepid. So what you're looking at here are some crew members on board the ship in World War II. The crew was entirely men. It was mostly white men, although there were people of color who served on board Intrepid. And the reason why is that Intrepid left service before rules changed in the Navy about women being allowed to serve on ships. So women didn't really start serving on ships in the Navy until the late 1970s, so a few years after Intrepid was taken out of service. And then women didn't serve on aircraft carriers for the first time until the 1990s. So in this period, it's good to keep in our mind, we're looking at posters that were shared across the United States, but on the ship itself, the crew was only men. So let's go and start looking at some of these posters here. But actually, before we start looking at the image, let's just talk a little bit about posters and what they were doing and sort of a general overview before we start looking at some of the specific posters and their imagery. So once the Pearl Harbor was attacked, right, on December 7th, 1941, the World War II really felt very immediate and personal to Americans. And the Office of War Information, which is the office that was responsible for putting out these messages, really wanted the emotional public in the United States to take action, right, to think of things they could do to support the war effort. And posters were a very important means of persuasion. And there were many, different things that these posters were encouraging women to do, which we'll look at in a minute. But it's also important to kind of look about some of the common themes that you're going to see as we talk through some of them today. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. So these are excerpts from a couple of posters that we're going to talk about in more detail, and just a few things that I want to draw your attention to so that we can keep them in the back or maybe in the front of our minds as we look through all of this imagery. The first thing to look at here, these are four different women depicted across three different posters. They're each encouraging women to do different things. But these are fairly common depictions of women. And one thing that jumps out, I think, to me at least, is that all the women depicted in these posters are white. And this is fairly consistent across really all propaganda posters produced by the Office of War Information during World War II. There are a few that are aimed at recruiting Black men into the military that I've seen. But as far as the ones aimed at women, all the ones in our collection at least depict white women. Of course, there are women of color who are working and raising families and following all these guidelines and joining different industries at this time. But in the images, this is what we tend to see. Also, you notice that these women are all very young and glamorous and made up. We see a lot of lipstick on these images, in the ones where you can see the women's hair, the hair is nicely coiffed. There's a lot of emphasis on clothing in these images. So whether it be uniforms for different things, we see a nurse uniform in the middle, we see an army uniform on the right. These images of women looking very glamorous and put together. And, a lot of these roles that women were being encouraged to step into during this time were considered to be new for women. I say considered to be because, of course, there are millions of women already working outside the home, especially working class women. But this idea of coming into these jobs was new. And, people who were creating these posters knew that there would be some Americans, men and women, who feel unsure, uncertain about having women serve in these different ways. What does that mean? And so a lot of these posters kind of juggle this traditional idea of women as objects of beauty with modern ideas about women's strength and capability to serve in these different ways. So we will see again, a lot of lipstick, a lot of nice hair, a lot of nice uniforms in these images, which are trying to present this notion of femininity as it involves serving your country in this way. So to give you a sense, I'm going to talk a little bit about women stepping into jobs. So that will include women in the military, women serving in war industries, and also women serving as nurses. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the things posters were encouraging women to contribute to on the home front for women who are not necessarily taking a job outside the home. So let's look at our example here. So here we have a poster, and this says, "For your country's sake today, for your own sake tomorrow." And this is a recruiting poster to encourage women to join the military during World War II. Now, before World War II, there were a few moments during World War I where women were also recruited to join the military. So the Army had some women serving in the Signal Corps. The Navy had some women serving as yeomen, which are basically doing clerical work. But in World War II, this was a much bigger emphasis. And the idea was really trying to free men to fight in the war. That by a woman coming in and doing a job in an office, say, in the United States, that man could then go and fight overseas. And really, for a lot of this, the question is less about the women's ability to do this kind of work. It's more about this cultural shift of seeing women as being able to participate in the Navy. Ooh, you may be getting some nice sirens here for my street outside. Anyway, so there was some resistance to the idea of enlisting women, even during this moment of crisis. And this was framed as something done temporarily for emergency purposes, right? That this is idea of women stepping into this role for the duration of the war. And service women, they did face some pushback, right? In some cases, their families disapproved of their decision to enlist in the military. They may have faced discrimination from some of their male colleagues in the military. And rumors about their character joining the military. So there was in some cases a lot of pushback, and so the military really was trying to struggle to define the role of women in what was really a traditionally masculine occupation. So we zoom in a little bit closer on these women in our poster. We see four women, and they are representing the different branches of the military that had women's volunteer reserves. So, and they had all been established by 1943. So, if you take a look at them, the woman on the far left, who's the lowest one in the image, sort of at the bottom of the diagonal here, that represents a woman from the Women's Army Corps. And a lot of these branches had these kind of catchy acronyms that you could pronounce as a word, right? So these are the WWIIs, if you've heard of that. So that's the Women's Army Corps. Next up, you have a woman in the WWIIs, woman accepted for volunteer emergency service, and that's the US Navy. Next, you have a woman representing the US Marine Corps Women's Reserve. And I appreciate this because they did not have a nickname. They were just Marines. So there's no little catchy acronym for them. And then the woman at the top of our diagonal here represents the US Coast Guard Women's Reserve. They were called the SPARS, which is it's an acronym based on the Coast Guard motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. And so you see the women here in their uniforms, lined up here again, looking made up and glamorous here, ready to serve. You may have heard of women who served in the Army Air Forces, the WASPs, and they were actually civilians. They were not considered members of the military. That's a whole other interesting question about their treatment and things in terms of benefits and stuff like that. So they're not depicted here because they're technically civilians serving with the military as opposed to actual members of the military. But yeah, so you can see these women here. So we have some other materials associated with these different branches. So let's take a look at the next one. So here is a poster of a woman who is serving with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. This later got shortened to the Women's Army Corps. So here are the WWIIs. And this poster, we see this woman in her uniform with an American flag behind her with the slogan on it, "This is my war too." And the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later Women's Army Corps, was established in May of 1942. And in this role, women served as weather observers, as radio operators, some served as mechanics, secretaries, and lots of other roles. And one thing we see here with this poster is, again, the power of the uniform as a marketing tool, which, by the way, was not strictly related to posters aimed at women. We know that the appeal of the uniform can inspire people to think about joining the military. And actually, some of our Intrepid former crew members talk about the Navy uniform, for instance, as something that looked really sharp and aspirational. So we see this woman in her uniform, and the director of the WWIIs really wanted the women's uniform to resemble the men's uniform, and give this sense of pride in serving in the Army. So this is it's a very strong image, and this woman is still depicted as being feminine, but also she's serious, and she looks competent and ready to serve. We do not have any posters associated with the WWIIs actually in the collection. Maybe that's something that we can remedy one day, but I want to highlight a couple artifacts we have associated with the WWIIs. So this is, again, we looked at the poster before, and all of the women who are depicted in the For Your Sake Today poster are all white. But there were Black women of color, serving in these branches, albeit it was a bit rocky depending on the branch. So only the WWIIs was the only one who allowed Black women to join from the very beginning. And in the case of the WWIIs, which we're looking at here, it wasn't until about a year or so after it was founded that Black women were allowed to enlist. And so one of my personal favorite objects that we have in the collection is this jacket, and it was worn by a woman named Harriet Ida Pickens, who in the photo is the one on the left, so closer to the jacket, the one who's more in the foreground. And she was one of only two Black women to serve as an officer in the WWIIs. She's standing next to Frances Wills, who is the other woman Black woman who served as an officer in the WWIIs. So So she, was handpicked. She was very educated. She's a New Yorker to serve in this role. And even though the Waves did change their policies to enlist Black women, by the end of the war, 80,000 women, approximately, give or take. You'll see slightly different numbers with that, but around 80,000 women served in the Waves. Only 72 of them were Black. So we're very proud to have Harriet's uniform in our collection, as her example as a sort of pioneer in the Waves at this point. We also have another. Oops, let me change the right thing here. Here we go. We don't have any posters of the women Marines either, but we do have an interesting uniform in the collection for this one as well. So here see an image of the of women lined up here, first group of women Marines. And the uniform belonged to a woman named Lily Gridley, who was a lawyer. And she initially joined the Navy, but then transferred over to the Marines. And she was the first woman to serve as a JAG, or a Judge Advocate General, in the Marine Corps. And she served until the 60s. She was still the only woman lawyer in the Marines through her entire time. And her uniform is on display. So if you come and visit us after Thursday, you can take a look at Lily Gridley's uniform on display in the exhibit. So the next thing I'm going to show you is not a poster, but it's still a print material here about another way that women served, not in the military exactly, but kind of military adjacent. And so this is a advertisement that says at the top, "I tame Hellcats," and this is an advertisement for Camel Cigarettes. And this is depicting a woman who had a really interesting career and history and service, and her name is Teddy Kenyon. Her first name is actually Cecil, but she went by Teddy. So this is the first panel of that advertisement. So it says, "I tame Hellcats," and she's of course got her Camel cigarette here. And it says it's Teddy Kenyon, ace woman pilot who tests the Navy's famous fighter plane, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. And so in 1943, Grumman, which is a major aircraft designer manufacturer, hired 3 women to serve as test pilots at their facility out in Bethpage, New York. And Teddy Kenyon was one of them. And so she and these other women, and Teddy had already had a career as a competitive pilot. And so she was on board to test these planes at Grumman. So initially, she and the other 2 women pilots were doing just short hops, and as they demonstrated that they could do it, they were doing longer flights, including a couple of aircraft that flew from Intrepid, the Hellcat depicted here, and also the TBF Avenger, which is a torpedo bomber. We have one of those on display in the hangar deck. And at first, some of the male pilots resented Teddy and her female compatriots, thinking that they didn't want them there. And the head of Grumman, apparently, his attitude was, if any male pilot doesn't like their presence, they can buzz off and go somewhere else. But they hung in there, these 3 women, and there were certain things that were restricted in terms of what they were allowed to do. So they weren't allowed to fly aircraft that were showing maybe maintenance problems. There were certain maneuvers they were barred from doing, but really, they proved that women could do this job, and also they had a strong media presence, as you can see by using Teddy Kenyon's likeness to sell cigarettes. So some women joined the military, but other women joined the workforce as well, and doing jobs that were considered essential for the war effort. Oops, hold on. Hang on a sec. Switching over. Okay. Sometimes there's a bit of a lag on these things. So look a little bit about women who are serving in the workplace. So we'll look at the poster more closely in a sec. But, of course, there were a lot of labor shortages during World War II. And so women were asked to step into industries where women might not have already served before. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this idea of Rosie the Riveter, which is not a poster we're going to look at today because we actually don't have a copy of that in the collection. But this idea of women stepping into different kinds of war industries. So this poster talks about industry, agriculture, and business. It's one thing I think is really important to keep in mind when we talk about women at work during World War II, sort of in the workforce separate from the military, is that there already were millions of women working in the United States at the start of the war. It's not as if all of a sudden, we went from 0 to millions of women, because many working class women were involved in paid work outside their home. People needed to be able to feed their families. And so women were working. It often seems like women are joining the workforce because a lot of these campaigns are aimed more at middle class women, or in some cases at married women who were less likely to be in the workforce. But there were over 11 million American women who were working at the start of World War II, and another 6.5 million women entered the paid workforce during the war. So that about a 50% increase in the number of women at work. And so again, we see here we'll go back to a bigger view of this very glamorous looking lady here. We saw a clip of her face earlier. Um, uh, in this image about finding your war job, right? I found the job where I fit best. And there's something very Hollywood-esque to me about this image. She's radiant, you see sort of glow around her. She has her hair neatly done up, lots of makeup, beaming at this piece of industrial equipment that she's operating. And a lot of these tasks were, of course, not very glamorous and clean, right? This is a lot of factory type work, grimy and exhausting, these industrial tasks. But there's still a pressure for women to appear to be well groomed and ladylike. And so you see, of course, the images are playing more on that level, probably showing exhausting, dirty work, but not really necessarily inspire too many people to jump on board anyway. But yeah, so we can see this woman here. And let's see, there are also cosmetic companies made different products aimed at women workers to try to entice sales of those products. So let's see, let's look at our next image. So here we have a poster that I believe is on display at the moment, and it says, the more women at work, the sooner we win. And this is more of a photographic treatment here. It's less this like stylized graphic design kind of thing we saw in the last one. So this is more of a photograph of a woman who is still very put together, working on what looks like an aircraft cockpit, working, and a list of occupations at the bottom where women are also needed, things like farm workers and typists and timekeepers and teachers and all sorts of things, bus drivers, a whole bunch of different occupations. And when we think about aircraft manufacturing, we think about this is an occupation where a lot of women did join the workforce. By some estimates, about 40% of workers in aircraft manufacturing were women, which is a pretty high percentage. I'll also note, as a side note, that this was actually not true in shipyards, interestingly enough. There's complicated reasons for that, just in terms of the amount of skills and experience required to build naval warships. But for aircraft, many women joined the workforce. And one thing I want to point out here, I think, is important to note is just a detail of this image. So you can see here, we have zoomed in on our worker, and she's wearing a yellow patch on her red jacket here. And what it says, which is probably hard to see just at the resolution of the copy of the poster here, is that it says temporary, right? So even this image trying to encourage people to join, there is this somewhat subtle, because it's small in the full size image, reminder that reminding women themselves, and also reminding men, right, that this is a temporary need. It's a wartime necessity. And women who worked in these jobs, if you listen to them talk about it or read, oral history accounts or books, for some women at the end of the war, they wish they could have stayed on. They wish they could have kept working. They either enjoyed the work, or they enjoyed the paycheck, or they enjoyed just the sense of competence and confidence that this instilled in them. But this was all considered at the time a temporary wartime necessity, like so many other things that were happening. And then here we have a man in this one as well, but another area that a lot of people don't necessarily think about when you're thinking about women joining the workforce during this time is that farms needed a lot of labor, right? So farm hands, or farm family sons are going off to either join the military, or in some cases take factory work, which is higher paid. So an organization called the U.S. Crop Corps was looking to encourage more people to do farm work, including looking for women. There's a branch called the Women's Land Army, which apparently placed hundreds of thousands of women on farms across the United States. So encouraging women to take up work in that way. And here we see this image. They look kind of romanticized in their overalls, and she's holding this basket of looks like some lovely kale and cauliflower and all kinds of nice things, which is nice to think about as spring is here, gazing off into the distance. But again, like working in factories, right? This is exhausting, tiring, dirty work, long days, and all of that stuff. So again, but we always want it. There was goal is to show the nice sides of these things. So we see these women at work here, and a man. Um, so switching gears a bit, I'll talk a little bit about women who served as nurses. So this is another occupation where more people needed to step up to do the work. And there was a nurse shortage during World War II. And so there are a number of different recruiting campaigns to encourage more women to serve as nurses. And, nursing was already by this point, and I guess continues to be considered like a feminine type occupation. So a job that was appropriate for women, for better or worse. So in a lot of cases, nurses face less, overt opposition than maybe a woman who is trying to join the military might, because that seemed more unconventional by the standards of the time. But you do see a lot of these posters aimed at recruiting women, do emphasize the feminine appeal of nurses. A lot of pretty young women depicted in these posters wearing stylish uniforms. But again, being a nurse is a really demanding job. Most nurses who were recruited were serving in the United States, filling shortages on the home front. But there were, a few tens of thousands of female nurses who did serve overseas with the military. And they, those nurses really, in World War II at least, experienced the horrors of the war probably more than any other group of American women. And battles are raging. These women are taking care of heavily wounded people out on the battlefront. So let's look at this picture more closely. One thing to note about this, so all the images that I'm showing you are photographs of the physical posters that are in our collection. So the collections team, carefully takes care of all these things, spreads out the posters, and goes over the top of them to take a picture. And you can see in this one that this particular poster is in a bit fragile condition. It's presumably, at least it's been in this condition as long as I've been at the museum, but you can see it's missing some corners. There's a little bit of staining on the top. So all of our work is to keep them preserved as well as possible. But this image in particular is a reminder that, some of these posters are, 70, 80 years old and are in tough condition. But this image shows is an advertisement for joining the American Red Cross. And we see here a smiling nurse in the center of this image wearing a very traditional nurse's uniform. She even has a cape on, and she is linking arms with an aviator, a soldier, a sailor, and a Marine. And the Red Cross had about 150,000 nurses on their rolls during World War II, so quite a lot of people. And the Red Cross nurses, in addition to providing care, often provided morale and comfort to injured service people as well. So the sight of a nurse was often very comforting for these military personnel who were serving during the war. But the Red Cross is not the only organization that is enlisting nurses during World War II. So this is a poster. This one's in better condition. No broken corners here, for the Cadet Nurse Corps. And this was an effort to enlist more, or to recruit more nurses. So this organization did a couple things. It gave financial support to schools of nursing across the United States, so to help them boost their facilities. And it also provided scholarships and stipends to women who would volunteer to serve as nurses. So kind of direct support for these women. And there were about 150,000 women who ultimately graduated from the Corps. And these women tended to serve on the home front, freeing more experienced nurses to go and serve with the military. So trying to get more people, again, working in hospitals here in the United States. And there was a very extensive marketing campaign for the Cadet Nurse Corps, and a lot of it is emphasizing that you will have a bright future if you sign up for the Nurse Corps, right? You will, in this case, it says you'll get a lifetime education. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on the uniform, which was very, deliberately designed to be attractive. and trying to show that there's a future in this career. And here they had some promotional films to encourage people. So here's a still from one of these promotional films. This is not in our collection, but showing, a woman graduating from her nursing class. See the nurses in the front, and what appears to be some parents or others in the background. And one thing to note with the nursing corps, which is really interesting and different than a lot of these other organizations, is that they provided this financial support to nursing schools across the United States, including um, money to places that primarily recruited minority nurses from minority communities, people of color. So, for instance, schools of nursing in the Navajo Nation, schools of nursing that primarily enrolled Black nurses. So, this organization was trying to boost the supply of nurses across the United States and across different racial groups, which is not always the case with some of these endeavors. Now, I mentioned that a lot of these posters are aimed at young single women, and so I appreciate this poster because this is a little bit different than some of the other ones. This is another poster aimed at recruiting nurses, but this nurse here looks quite a bit different than some of the nurses that we are looking at in some of our other posters. So if we switch over here, we can see a close-up view of this woman. She's wearing a wedding ring. So this is a married nurse. She appears to be a little bit older than some of the nurses depicted in the other posters. And as the war went on, some of these advertising campaigns did kind of broaden their imagery or their appeal to try to recruit women who were married or possibly a little bit older, looking to have more people serving in these capacities. And this nurse, she's also wearing pants, and she still is made up to some extent, but she looks very warm and very confident and very strong in her role. So this next one, we'll look at this more closely in a minute, but just to give some context. First of all, I will say this poster we're going to talk about now is my favorite of all of these posters. And I think because it's just overwhelming with the amount of information on it. So for me, trying to think about this period to be able to read all these things is really great. And so I really like this poster. I also like all the little graphics on it. But what we just looked at were posters trying to encourage women to step into jobs, right? Work in an aircraft factory, join the Women's Army Corps, become a nurse. But there was this idea that there's a role for women on the home front. So even if you are not stepping out to get a job, you still have a lot of work that you can do to support the war, from the way you manage your own household. And there was an ever expanding list of things that people at home needed to remember, as far as restrictions on materials, or on goods and things or materials that you might purchase, price ceilings, things that you're supposed to conserve. There's actually a lot of thinking and understanding and knowing when you're operating like a household on the home front during World War II, of what you were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And so it was complicated. And for many women, they felt really gratified that they were able to do something from home to help support American service people overseas. But it was really complicated and stressful. And there was an expectation that women were going to embrace these restrictions kind of without complaint. So you see during this period in women's magazines and things, instructions, for instance, to not, if you're writing to your husband who's serving in the war, to not dwell on all the complexities of your life, about shortages or about any other hardships, that you should not be passing on these complaints to your husband, because he already has enough to worry about. So you are supposed to learn how to manage in this environment without complaint. So this poster is called the Homemaker's War Guide, and it is crammed with words and graphics and tips and things to help you understand sort of what you're supposed to do on the home front. And there's a wealth of advice on all kinds of topics, from how to plan meals to collect scraps, safety from bombs, all sorts of things. So if we look at a snippet of it a little bit more closely here, this is the top of the poster. And so it says Homemaker's War Guide, and the imagery across the top in the center is a little image of a woman standing in a home, which is outlined in red, and she's got a pot or a frying pan or something. So she's there cooking. And then next to her are women nurses and women serving in the military and tanks and all that sort of other stuff. So there's all these women and all these different roles, but right in the center, the heart of this image is the woman at home, right? What can you do? And there are three different buckets of information on this poster: plan, conserve, and salvage. So I'll take a look. We'll look at three more posters that kind of hit upon something that appears in each of those categories, right, in this poster. So the first one is about planning. So this woman, as it says here, is out to lick runaway prices, right? She's out to beat them. So this woman, again, has some very nicely done fancy hair, which I have to say, I'm amused by the hair in these pictures, because with hair like this, it would never end up in that neat kind of wave, but that's all right. She got her very like ruffly looking apron on and is attempting to look tough in her, standing up for runaway prices. And so there was a government office called the Office of Price Administration, which was dealing with different measures about the prices of goods for sale on the home front, and specifically trying to prevent inflation. So because women are the ones who were managing household budgets primarily at this time, a lot of these posters were aimed at women and about how you manage your finances during the war. So this addresses things like rationing, right? About you're only able to purchase certain amounts of certain things. There are price ceilings to try to prevent inflation. So you should know how much the maximum you're allowed to pay for different things, and not pay more than that, right? Not allow prices to get driven up. In some cases, in some cities, women were sent out as secret shoppers to go to different grocery stores and other places to make sure that the stores were abiding by these price ceilings. So this idea about making sure it's a woman's responsibility to make sure that prices don't get totally out of line. So that's one under the plan bucket. This is under the idea of salvaging. I also really like this one. I think this is a really funny image. So this says, use it up, wear it out, make it do. And this poster is showing a woman who is repairing her husband's pants, right? She's patching a pair of pants. And the idea is that war production limited the use or the availability of certain resources for consumer goods. So things like fabric, things like metal, certain kinds of foods, all this sort of thing. So posters like this were encouraging Americans to limit unnecessary consumption and to not waste anything. And that is something that is patriotic and supporting of the war effort. So so there's a sense of frugality in this poster, but what I also really like about it is this funny, what I at least kind of interpret as this sort of sense of urgency here, because this guy is, presumably the husband, right, of this woman. Probably that would be the relationship where you'd be sewing the person's pants when the pants are still on the person. But the guy is bending over, putting oil in his lawnmower. And so he couldn't stop what he was doing enough to let her fix his pants. Like, she's actually fixing the pants on the guy. This seems a little risky to me, although maybe this woman is better at patching things than I am. But I don't know. I wouldn't want somebody patching that part of my pants while they're on me. But in any event, save things, reuse them, and that helps support the war effort. And then the next one to look at that is related to the Homemaker's War Guide is this one, which is also, I think, a interesting and powerful image as well. So this is a really graphic connection between the home front, specifically the kitchen, and the battlefield. So what this poster says is, save waste fats for explosives, take them to your meat dealer. And what we see in this image is a woman's hand, very nice fingernails, with a cast iron skillet, and she's pouring it down, and then a bunch of bullets and bombs and things are exploding out of where she's pouring the waste fats. And in 1942, the War Production Board began encouraging Americans, specifically women, again, right, because women are presumed to be the ones cooking, to save waste fats because they're a source of glycerin, which can be used for making explosives. And so these posters were aimed at women again to do this work. So I think this is a really, a visceral image. And apparently by the end of the war, American households had saved something like 380 million pounds of kitchen fats, which is a lot. So again, this falls into the category of conserving materials for the war. So we have one more poster to look at today, as we conclude this, walk through some examples of our collection. And this is an image for buying war bonds. So the US government issued these bonds that people could buy to help finance the war effort. And a lot of these posters, if you've seen any war bonds posters, you often see posters of soldiers in them. Support him out on the battlefield, buy war bonds. But this one is focusing on a family. This is a romanticized image here of this blonde woman and her baby. um it's almost a religious image in a sort of way, her holding this baby, this lamb and everything else. And it's compelling people to think about, your family, and how supporting the war effort is not just supporting people who are fighting directly. It's also supporting this future of sort of the American way of life, this idealized kind of middle class domesticity, and this idea that that victory in the war would result in a prosperous future for all Americans at home. And I think in looking at all these posters and this sort of whirlwind tour of things that we have in the collection, and also what they say about not only what women were doing during the war, but also how this was being envisioned and idealized, and how Americans are thinking about these issues. The U.S. government was mobilizing women as part of this overall strategy for victory in combat. Women were helping to achieve a particular goal, and that goal is victory. And there's a lot of different ways that this can happen. That can happen from getting a job, joining the military. That can happen from just doing day-to-day things in your own life. How can each person contribute to the war effort? But again, as we've talked about already, the expectation was that women were going to um, they were going to return to their traditional roles. Oops, at the end of everything. So, but for women, women had different feelings about this at the end. There are many women who were happy to go back, right, to go back to their lives as they were before. They had stepped up to participate for the duration of the war, and they were happy to go back. And there were other women who really wanted to continue doing whatever these new jobs were, right? People who wanted to keep working outside of the home, people who wanted to stay in the military or stay as nurses, whatever else they were doing. And these experiences really helped catalyze social changes in the United States going beyond World War II. So we know in 1948, for example, women earned the right to enlist as regular members of the US military. That's also the same year that the armed forces were integrated. So that's a year of big change for the US military in 1948. And then in the 1950s, there was this sort of idea, the Cold War's happening, this kind of 1950s idealized domestic idea. But then you have, moving forward, women agitating for more rights in the 1960s, right? Women's movement and everything else. So these posters give us a glimpse of a moment in time, and help us think about sort of World War II on the home front, and what was happening, and remind us that a lot of significant changes were afoot. So thank you so much for tuning in today. It's great to be able to share collections. Clearly, as you can see from my not so exalted background, I'm not currently on the ship at the moment, and it's great to be able to take the things we have and share them with all of you. So I'm really grateful. We're continuing to do these live streams, even though we are reopening. We do want to continue reaching out to all of you through this way. It's a really great way to share things with people who may not be able to come visit us even when we are open. So please be sure to follow and subscribe to our channel if you want to learn more about what is coming up. And also, there are links in the description. And also, again, if you were able, your donations of any amount help us make all of our programming possible. And we are so grateful for all of that as well. And I will say one last, again, reminder, because I'm super excited that we are reopening this Thursday, and I hope that over the course of the next year, as people are able, that you will come and visit us in person, because there's nothing quite like being on board the ship itself. So thank you so much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.